When it comes to roguelikes, there's no shortage of options, but very few can lay claim to being truly great. The genre originated naturally from the now rather old game Rogue, but really it wasn't until The Binding of Isaac in 2011 that the genre was brought into mainstream awareness. And since then, Isaac has come to be the gold standard by which all subsequent entries into the genre have been judged. By this logic, many would call it the best the genre has to offer. And for a while, that was probably true. But this explosion in popularity inspired hundreds of similar games, and many have innovated in quite interesting ways. And then along came Supergiant, the indie studio known for its compelling worlds, beautiful art, and constant innovation, who delivered Hades. In some ways, Hades is the culmination of decades of learning and the single greatest game in the genre, and in other ways it's also a terrible roguelike. So what's going on here? What can cause a game to be simultaneously amazing and also lackluster? Well, grab something to eat, settle in, and allow me to explain just what's happening here to cause such a divisive split, because it's undeniable that Hades shows off a godlike prowess, but there's also some dark revelations hiding beneath the surface.
But enough with the smart talk already. I'm here to do a job.
Hades is a masterpiece. Full stop. That doesn't mean it's without flaws, and certainly we'll be exploring some of those in great detail, but it's undeniable that Hades is something truly unique within the gaming landscape. Now, I know that not everyone will agree, and there's probably already someone who disliked the video before even reaching this point.
I don't care if you hate me.
But while not everyone enjoys the same things, there's a lot of objectively smart design in here that I think people can respect, even if it's not for them. I'm going to start by explaining what makes Hades so phenomenal, so you can properly understand why Hades is deserving of the title Best Roguelike of all time, before I get into why it also fails at being a great roguelike. Before I go any further, I want to issue a spoiler warning. I will be discussing and showing spoilers from all parts of the game and also lightly touching on elements from several related games. If you want to experience Hades in the most fresh way possible, go do that now. It's worth it, I promise.
Now let's go!
Now what better place to start the discussion than with its narrative? The primary focus of this video is to analyze Hades through the lens of roguelikes and to figure out why it both succeeds and fails to be a proper roguelike. So I don't want to spend much time talking about the narrative, but I would be remiss not to touch on a few key aspects. The overall narrative of Hades is fine. It's a compelling tale of familial strife, stubbornness, and the specific confusion of parental relations, particularly when viewed through the overly optimistic lens of a child who doesn't know nor understand what transpired before their existence. But on the whole, it's nothing heart-wrenching nor particularly emotional. At least, if you read the Wikipedia summary of the plot. However, Hades expertly fuses the narrative build with roguelike mechanics in order to create a dynamically unfolding storyline that elevates the prose to something much greater than just the words on a page. Every time the player dies, they return to the base and have a few short conversations with the crew before heading out again. In this way, the narrative is drip-fed over the course of a much longer play experience, slowly advancing the plot but never getting too bogged down at any one moment. This is clever for a few reasons. First, it creates an inherently compelling pacing where the player isn't stuck reading an hour of dialogue without making any gameplay decisions. For a game with obvious visual novel inspirations, this structure stands in stark contrast to the vast majority of that genre. Secondly, it also flips the narrative progression of most games on its head. Traditionally, dying in a game results in a reset of the world state, with the game treating everything as if you had never died at all. Being a roguelike, Hades obviously couldn't tell a narrative with that limitation, and thus found a perfect lore hook to justify Zagreus' constant deaths, and actually have death be the primary element that enhances the narrative. Thirdly, it captures what many would call the Mass Effect magic of returning to the hub and catching up with all your cool friends. Many games have done this, but BioWare really mastered it, and Hades takes full advantage of that to create this compelling cast of characters that the player is excited to speak to every time they go home. This all culminates in creating an expertly designed system where the player almost wants to die just to see what new things people have to say. In many other roguelikes, dying feels frustrating, possibly inducing a feeling of despair at the idea of having to trudge through all of that over again. Hades alleviates much of that feeling by making death feel so enjoyable that by the time you finish speaking to everyone, you're pumped to go back and do it all over again.
I'm ready.
And part of that is because it's not just limited to the hub. Every character you interact with during escape attempts, be they god, guardian, or prisoner, has something new to say when you find them during the run too. The plot is always advancing no matter what part of the game you are in. Sure, it's usually not the main plot, but that also lends to the compelling nature of the narrative too. Every character has some kind of subplot to explore, so no matter which thread you follow, there's something interesting to discover. So while the actual plot of Hades would be a mediocre movie, the narrative experience that is fused so elegantly into the gameplay is something far greater. The world and the characters feel like they are reacting to you specifically. When you die to something embarrassing, Hypnos will mock you for it.
You look like someone who just got turned to stone, then crushed to a bloody pulp by the Mega Gorgon of Asphodel. Am I right?
When you've reached a new zone or completed some other accomplishment, characters will praise you for it. When you meet a new character, others will discuss them. When you have a certain item or boon, gods will comment on it. When you bring a specific weapon, people will mention it. When you do a lot of fishing, Poseidon will be joyful. When you turn on the speedrun timer, Hermes will give you advice. It feels like just about everything you do will have someone somewhere saying something new directly acknowledging that thing. Nothing sells a world more than having the world react to the player doing random, innocuous things. And this extends beyond even direct conversations. Simply smashing pots or attacking an NPC will bring out even more comments,
You show those dusty pots.
just like an actual person would if you were flailing about in real life. After hundreds of runs, I was still getting new comments about this thing or that thing. There is a seemingly infinite amount of dialogue recorded for this game, and I cannot stress enough how much this improves the experience. Most roguelikes don't even have fully voiced dialogue, and even games with far more massive budgets seem to fall into repeat dialogue very quickly.
Quite honestly, I fail to see why.
When I reached the 100-hour mark in Hades, I still hadn't heard a single repeated dialogue. That level of dedication cannot be praised enough, especially so considering the unique personalities behind each of the different characters delivering those lines. But the narrative ties in another beautiful way too. See, Hades is a game built on compelling decisions. And I don't mean decisions from the devs, though that's certainly true too, but rather you, the player, are constantly confronted with compelling decisions. And the narrative reward structure that so elegantly merges with the roguelike design of the game also creates an additional vehicle for compelling decision opportunities. Sometimes when choosing where to go next, the player will be given the option of choosing a character event room. These typically have less useful rewards than getting another boon, however, they will allow the player to advance the storyline of another side character, and that might be worth having a less powerful build. Sure, you'll probably see them again in another run or two, but you could have a chat with them right now. To me, visiting Eurydice is worth it just to listen to her sing for a while. And any choice that can convince the player to take a less optimal choice in order to do something more fun is a good design. There's no other roguelike where I would willingly give up power just to hear 2 lines of dialogue from an unimportant NPC.
I'm pretty impressed here.
Now, there will also be players who simply don't care about the narrative. It's a subjective thing and you will never satisfy everyone. But at the same time, there's so much more to the game than its narrative, and if you were so inclined, you could easily and quickly skip past all of it without dragging the experience down either. With a handful of exceptions, you can skip past all of the plot with a couple button presses, and you could stroll right past all of the conversations waiting for you at home if you truly didn't want to engage with it at all.
You don't have to do anything of the sort.
But if you're going to do that, then the core gameplay has to be pretty damn good, right? From the moment Athena grants you your first boon, this game makes you feel like the demigod you are. The controls are tight, the abilities are fun, and the enemies are engaging. But let's look a little deeper at those, shall we? Zagreus at his core has 5 abilities, though you will only start with 4. There's the dash, the attack, the special, and the cast, and then later on the call, and technically a 6th active item slot. Each of these moves is distinct. The dash is a fluid movement ability, the attack is a core multi-hit combo, the special is a stronger alternative attack, the cast fires a bloodstone ammo type, and the call has a special unique effect based on the god chosen. This core moveset already puts Hades ahead of most roguelikes in terms of variety of options. When you start Binding of Isaac, for example, you can shoot in 4 directions and move around. That's it.
Your technique pales in comparison.
Now that comparison is a bit reductive, but we'll circle back here again later. The main point is that controlling Zagreus just feels good, even with 0 upgrades of any kind. And this is important because almost every roguelike suffers from the fresh start problem, where until you get a few upgrades, the base character just feels kind of boring. Every new run of Slay the Spire starts with me trudging through the same exact steps with the boring starter deck until I find a few pieces to get something interesting to happen. Hades expertly avoids that problem, and even if that tedium does begin to creep in, there's 6 different weapons to use, which admittedly only mixes up 2 of the core actions, but goes a long way to keeping it fresh. Sure, Isaac has a ton of characters, but most of those are just different stats using the same weapon in combat, and maybe an extra starting item. But what's even more impressive is the way the boons interact with those systems. Ignoring Hermes, there are 8 major gods that offer various powers, and each one upgrades those core abilities in unique ways that can radically change your playstyle for the run. Getting Zeus's lightning bolts on the shield's special can create a game-winning ranged build. Getting Demeter's dash upgrade can create a viable dash-only strategy. Athena's deflect on your attack can open up space for a run based on making enemies hit themselves instead of ever attacking directly. If it's not clear from these examples, the brilliance is twofold here. First is that the core suite of options is extremely modular. Each of the 5 core abilities can be upgraded with any of the 8 gods' blessings, meaning each move has 8 variants that all come with different advantages. Dionysus wants you to get multiple hits in to stack poison, Poseidon wants to push away things, Zeus wants to do wide area damage, and so on. They encourage different avenues of strategy so that even with the same weapon and base moves, the player has to actively strategize differently based on the tools available. Secondly, they create unique combinations as well. Your attack can have one of 8 boons, and then your cast can have one of 8, and then your call can have one of 8, and so on. Mathematically, there's 32,768 different combinations.
I am keeping count, and I am most impressed.
Though that's certainly overselling the actual level of diversity, as the difference between most of those is not wildly different. Realistically, there's closer to a couple hundred, as the important difference is not which ability has the specific god, but rather which few gods you've collected, though sometimes the specific ability is quite important. This opens up space to take the Doom effect from Ares and put Poseidon's knockback on a different ability, encouraging a playstyle of proccing Doom and knocking the enemy away until it detonates to stay safe, or using Demeter's Chill to slow an enemy, making it easier to hit with Dionysus' large explosive cast upgrade. This again feeds into the diversity and variety of options, combined with the different weapons, such that each run has exciting new discoveries to make. Even on your 100th run, you can still be discovering new strategies based on a weird boon and weapon combo that you hadn't quite thought of or found before.
I never even knew you existed.
And that's the beauty of Hades' boon system. With just a select few exceptions, every one of the dozens of boons is an interesting, unique upgrade, and not simply a slight number tweak or a small % modifier. Sure, some can come with modifiers in addition to the unique effect, but almost every boon is a meaningful special reward. There are no boring upgrades or uninspired upgrades. The player is always getting something new that makes them think, okay, how can I change my strategy to make use of that now? This is extraordinarily rare within games at large, but especially roguelikes, where often the majority of items offered are simple stat increases. I'm not saying that it's wrong to have upgrades that are basic stat upgrades, and certainly it's always good to get damage up in Risk of Rain or health up in Returnal, but it's far more exciting when it feels like every item does something important and meaningful. Every single time that I see a boon room, I'm excited about which option I'm going to get. No one's ever screamed in joy over finding a 5% increase to attack speed.
I know. You're right, of course you're right.
And the design of these boon offerings is also very masterful. There's maybe a handful that I think are not particularly useful. Most of them at least offer something to think about, and on top of that, they have a very clever upgrade structure behind it as well. See, the first boon you get from a god will either be a utility option or a core move upgrade. Once you've unlocked the core move ability, you start getting unique upgrades related to that god's effect. Poseidon starts by putting knockback on one of your abilities, and then he offers extra damage on slamming enemies into walls, a damage over time effect on enemies knocked back, an AoE explosion when slamming into walls, a second knockback effect after the first, and so on.
Very clever.
This system not only creates meaningful differences in the way that the player can make use of these tools, but also cleverly subverts a massive problem that almost every, if not every roguelike suffers from, and that's synergy bloat.
Why, it must be the opposite of everything to which you are accustomed.
Every roguelike has built-in synergies between certain items or cards or whatever mechanic the game uses, and the more items get added in, the less likely the player is to find the relevant synergies. In Slay the Spire, for example, it's often difficult to play many types of builds because the synergy cards all individually suck, so the player has to take cards worsening their deck in the hopes that they luck into the relevant synergy pieces before they die.
I don't think you're gonna be so lucky.
Hades alleviates that by not offering the synergy picks until after the base has been claimed. Zeus will never give you larger lightning bolts if you don't yet have lightning bolts. Hand in hand with this synergy bloat is item bloat. One of Isaac's largest problems nowadays is that there's so many of every type of item that you could reasonably go through a massive chunk of the game without getting any upgrades to a certain stat or any synergistic items at all. Early on in the game's life, you could reliably get one of 2 massive damage up items and win the run from that alone every couple of runs or so. Even if the ratio is kept the same and there's still X% of items for that synergy, the player still gets the same flat number. You could get 10 items in a row only increasing health. That sucks. That's worse than nothing, because now it's also going to take longer to die so that I can start a new run and have fun again.
Well, if you're going to be so rude about it.
And I hate to keep picking on Isaac, but understand that every game I am comparing Hades to in this video needs to be at the peak of the genre. After all, I didn't title this video Why Hades is Better Than a Bunch of Mediocre Roguelikes. I want to compare it to the best.
And I'm sure nobody here is going to mind.
I've played almost 85 roguelikes so far, and every single one with unlockable progression suffers from this, except Hades.
But I was so naive to think that they were different.
Even in Slay the Spire, when you unlock new cards for a class, you're actually diluting the pool so that the existing synergies become a little harder to put together each time. It makes completing objectives and unlocking new rewards feel confusingly bittersweet. I've done a good job and have been rewarded with the game being a bit less fun.
Utterly senseless.
Games like Griftlands have used solutions whereby the player can toggle on or off each unlocked card set, but this still inhibits the player from seeing all of the cool options as well. Rather than limiting the player to only certain options at the start, Hades cleverly stops new gods from appearing after the player has found their first few. That way, the player is always getting cool expansions to their power set for the run, and not constantly sorting through stuff that would be good for a different run, but it's too late to be useful on this run.
How very thoughtful there, my king.
I said earlier that Hades is built on compelling decisions, and that's exactly what I'm describing here. The game lets the player choose from a list of 3 boons each time the player speaks with the god, but if 2 of those boons were for a different synergy, there isn't actually a compelling choice. Only one option is worth thinking about, and thus the player hasn't really made a choice at all.
Oh, I had little choice.
Because Hades fudges the randomization behind the scenes like this, it means that the player is always looking at interesting options. In Slay the Spire, I often find that choosing none of the 3 cards available is the best choice, because I don't want to dilute my deck. And there's nothing less fun for a player than being rewarded for their hard work with nothing. It might even feel worse than getting nothing, as you could have gotten something good but didn't, adding an extra sting to the pain.
Oh, the cruel fates!
Because of this, Hades lets the player shape their build in a much more intentional manner, making it feel much more like the result of your own actions rather than what luck you happen to stumble into. If your run fails, it's much more likely that it was because you played poorly, rather than because you just never found the right synergy pieces. And this goes beyond just choosing boons. Unlike many roguelikes such as Isaac, where you can explore every room of a floor, Hades limits the player in a very interesting way. Each room will give the player a choice of exits, and since Zagreus can only go down 1, that creates yet another compelling decision, and further lets the player have intentionality over their run. You, the player, are choosing to take health over another boon, or choosing to visit Artemis over Ares, or like I mentioned earlier, choosing to advance a narrative over getting a more useful item. These are all interesting and engaging choices for the player. It also gives the player risk versus reward opportunities, where maybe you can choose a more difficult challenge room because you want that greater reward, or maybe you take the lesser reward because you don't quite think you'll survive that mini-boss room.
There may be times when it is necessary, of course.
But above all, there's no going back. You can't put off the room to come back later. You have to make a choice and live with the consequences. This also nicely saves the player from having to do endless backtracking and time-wasting activities that other roguelikes can get bogged down with. There's no running back and forth across empty rooms to bring the right things to the right places. You clear a room, maybe interact with 1 or 2 things in the room, and advance to the next. Every run is quick, with little or no dead time. This is a major problem that even some great roguelikes can fall into. No matter how great the mechanics are, if each run takes so long that starting a new run feels like a massive undertaking, it becomes much harder to find that desire to go again, especially after a particularly long defeat.
It just seemed to suck the life right out of me.
I want to quickly note as well that the Infernal Trove system also complements this all beautifully. It's yet another optional choice within a room to risk taking more damage for a potential reward, which perfectly exemplifies the core risk versus reward design ethos of the roguelike genre. The timed rooms and the Thanatos rooms also perfectly execute on this goal, as they randomly spice up a room with an interesting challenge. Since you get extra gold from kills in the timed rooms, and get a bonus for outperforming Thanatos, you can play riskier to get more rewards, but you can also just dodge and run out the clock too. The room will clear itself, so if you don't want to risk it, you can use it as a freebie room.
Avoiding conflict is an option here.
It's up to the player to make that choice. The narrative and character progression is also tied to the player intentionality in a neat way. Because conversations are initiated with a generic currency of nectar, the player can choose which characters they are more interested in hearing from and advance the various side stories with more direct focus rather than purely relying on the random chance of who shows up.
Entirely by chance, this did occur.
Each god gives a trinket that forces them to show up at least once, and that trinket can be changed out after each floor, so this allows the player to intentionally spec their build in a certain way. Did you pick up some synergy that would be amazing with a Zeus spoon? Once you finish the floor, you can guarantee he'll show up and lock in that build path. But using that trinket also comes at the cost of not using a different trinket that might have given a better benefit for the run. So again, the player is forced to contemplate another interesting tactical decision. Maybe getting that gold boost is really important right now. Or maybe you really want to have the backstab bonus for the enemies on this floor in particular. Or maybe you'll get lucky and find Zeus naturally. Each of the weapons has a uniquely different playstyle, and some boons will be wildly more or less powerful depending on which you choose. Ares adding Doom to the sword's special AoE is quite powerful, but adding Doom to the bow's special arrow volley is extremely ineffective. But also, if you get the synergy where Doom can stack, then suddenly the boon is exceptionally strong again. There's also the hammer upgrades that can alter each weapon in fun and unique ways, making the player pivot their build plan even without any boons to consider. And additionally, each weapon has 4 total variants which each have a unique effect, providing even more diversity in the options available. And you can choose those willingly before each run so as to have more control over your plan. All of this variety provides the player with endless sub-goals during gameplay to try and actively seek out the proper tools to fulfill their build for this run. And Hades expertly weaves all these systems together to make it fun, interesting, and most importantly, rewarding to chase after these sub-objectives within each run and feel like a true demigod when it all comes together.
Feels pretty good now that you mention it.
Having said that, there's also some unfortunate consequences of that design, and ones that almost seem antithetical to roguelike design. So allow me to switch into the critique side of this discussion and tell you why this seemingly masterful system also kind of sucks.
Finally. I've been waiting for this.
What makes a good roguelike is very subjective, and certainly there's no shortage of debate. Some even use a new word, Rogue-lite, to draw a hard distinction between rogue successors with meta progression and those with none. This can be an interesting topic of discussion, but it also can be somewhat pointless, as the entire point of creating new things is to change it in some way, so adherence to any particular definition can be more limiting and detrimental to the creation of something great.
It is not the same. The entire feel of it's completely different now. You'll see.
I'm not going to comment on like versus light any more than that, but given the passion some have, I wanted to at least acknowledge it and say, I understand you. If you want to call Hades a roguelite and not a roguelike, that's fine.
Be gone from here. We've nothing to discuss.
Focusing on the rogue part of roguelike, however, the core idea is starting a new run over and over again, trying to get further and farther each time, and adapting your strategies based on the randomness of the level generation, the items, the weapons, or whatever other factors the game has used to tweak the play experience.
Keep getting better the more you try. Turns out a bit different each time.
In that way, Hades allowing so much player intentionality can almost remove the randomness element entirely. If you wanted to, you could only ever use the same one weapon each time, and use the trinkets to hard force the same few gods and choose the same options from each boon selection. You won't get the exact same experience, but you can make it shockingly similar if you really try. Now, part of that is on the player. Every game is boring and samey if you don't use any of the game's tools, but as human beings, we also tend to gravitate towards things we know and feel comfortable with. Why risk taking a new boon when I know this other path will work well enough because I've done it already?
You shall ruin everything, with all your damnable questions.
Sure, the other option might be even better, but if all I need to do is beat Hades, then the choice that I know works is perfectly sufficient. And this kind of defeats the design intent of rogue and roguelikes. The fun comes from never knowing what wacky things might happen in the next run.
Your unpredictability is one of your assets.
I criticized Isaac earlier for having a bunch of characters that all play basically the same, with only moving and shooting, but that's offset because the items in that game can have game-breakingly wild amounts of change. You can replace your basic tiers with brimstone, or lasers, or orbiting tiers, or use manually movable permanent objects. Hades does have duo boons, which are transistor-esque combinations of the powers of multiple gods in handcraftedly unique ways. However, these boons are still standardized to never create truly broken results, in a good or bad way. And personally, I think they could have taken the duo boons a lot farther.
Nonetheless, this was an opportunity.
In Hades, every run with the bow will end with you shooting the bow. That's reductive and not entirely true. Maybe you found really strong cast or dash only options, but you get the idea. What I mean here is that because Hades fudges the numbers so that you're always getting something at least useful, there's a cap on how wild your runs can be. Ironically, Hades never quite lets the player be truly godlike.
Explain to me how exactly this is possible.
There's so many ways to just break the game in Isaac. Ways to go infinite and get every item available, ways to create literally unlosable runs with item combinations, and also items that can cause instant game overs. Items that can break your entire build, causing you to die in the next room. So while Hades doesn't have any run-losing boons, there's also no way to break the game. Zagreus' power is standardized so that everything is varying levels of good, but you'll never pick up something and shout with joy knowing that the entire run just became trivial. And maybe that's good. Having a trivial difficulty can be super boring for some players, but for many other players, they want to feel like a god amongst mortals and revel in that power fantasy.
I'm a fellow student of death, you see.
In my experience, most roguelike players can be put into one of three categories. One group just wants to see everything, finish the game, and move on. I think this is the largest group and the most casual and normal type of player. For them, Hades will be perfectly fine as a roguelike, and even possibly excellent due to the narrative experience they'll have. The second group, which I'll call speedrunners, wants to win as fast as possible. They enjoy the challenge of trying to win with as little as possible and pushing the margins as tight as they can. This group will also likely have no issue with Hades as a roguelike. The final group is the Timmies of the world. For them, the entire point of a roguelike is not winning, but seeing how stupidly powerful you can get before destroying everything in the most ridiculous and bombastic fashion. This group will inevitably be let down, as no matter how hard you try, Hades will not let you become truly godlike. There are weaker and stronger builds and synergies, but there is no god run of Hades. There's no run that feels like you turned on all the cheats of a PS2 game.
You're no god. You're nothing but a piece of trash.
There's also a lack of variety in some other aspects and a strict linearity that can feed into this anti-roguelike design ethos as well. The zones will always be in the same order, with no alternative variants and no alternative paths. You will always see Tartarus, then Asphodel, then Elysium, then Styx, in that order. There's no water version of Asphodel or burning version of Tartarus. There's no side zones that let you explore out of order, and no alternative routes to reach different endings.
You get exactly what you asked, and nothing more.
Even within each floor, there's no short or long versions. There's no XL floors and no way to skip the floor if you find the boss right away. You always move in a straight line through the world.
You cannot change the course that has been set.
The final zone being a minor exception as it partially fulfills these goals, but again in a very standardized way where you can leave early but never immediately and almost always after 2 or 3 of the 5 chambers are completed. A very core part of roguelikes is exploring, finding secrets, and unlocking hidden content you had no idea existed. Hades has almost no secrets of that manner.
You know now what you're doing here is without any purpose whatsoever.
The closest thing we have to that is the Charon boss fight, and even that's more of a rare event than a secret, as it's hard to miss when it actually does show up. Isaac excels because of all the unique hidden content that rewards doing different and wacky things. Some characters get unlocked by not healing for a certain period of time, or by using the right item in the right room, or by even more convoluted quest lines. Finding out how secret rooms work, or learning about super secret rooms, or figuring out that beating Mom fast enough unlocks a boss rush bonus room, or unlocking remixed versions of early areas with new and remixed enemies and rooms, or discovering that after beating Mom a few times she evolves, revealing a much harder zone with even more content, enemies, bosses, and so on.
Well, I knew you'd handle that old crone.
All of these are incredibly fun to unlock and get the player thinking about how they interact with the game in unique ways. Hades is remarkably straightforward in comparison, with next to nothing in terms of mid-run exploration or discovery beyond your build. Every run ends with Hades. Likewise, every zone ends with the same boss too.
Isn't there someone else around to challenge me, say Heracles?
There's a way to unlock remixed versions of each boss, and each of those is fun and well designed in its own right, but the manner in which you unlock these things is disappointingly basic. You just beat Hades enough and then talk to enough people and it's there for you to turn on. There's no mid-run surprise that it suddenly happened, and no revelation discovering a cool secret. Imagine showing up to fight the Hydra and learning that because you accidentally did too much damage to his leash last time, now he's free and getting the remixed version of the fight that way. That's a cool and interactive secret to discover. Toggling on Hydra hard mode from a checklist at the start of the run is markedly less fun.
Truthfully, I hoped that I could make it a surprise.
I could keep listing off secrets from different games and suggesting secret ideas for Hades ad nauseum, but I think you understand by now.
Are you finished?
This all comes together to form this very weird situation where Hades actually has a ton of variety, but also does next to nothing to encourage the player to interact with it, and actually provides too many tools to not engage with it.
Look, I've done some things that maybe aren't great.
Hades does have a few ideas, and quite good ones at that, at alleviating that problem. Things like placing a currency bonus on a random weapon each run, which quietly tricks the player into choosing a different weapon each time instead of just spamming the one they like the most over and over, though the player still could do that. Each trinket also levels up based on usage, encouraging the player to mix and match to level them all, though if you didn't like the trinket's effect originally, you probably won't care about getting the stronger version. The heat system also needs to be leveled up separately on each different weapon, encouraging usage of all of them. Kind of. More on that later.
Silence, boy. Save all your ignorant and baseless accusations.
Hades also features an achievement system, and this perfectly demonstrates that problem. Other roguelikes typically have lots of these types of secrets and will reward doing specific, unique things. Hades makes the builds unique and fun, but fails to give the player incentive to actually try new things. The Fated List of Prophecies, which serves as this game's achievement system, gives the player a bunch of tasks to complete. However, the tasks are perhaps the least interesting tasks possible. Almost every single one is simply do everything or do something a lot of times.
A threshold from which there is no escape.
I think the design intent is to give the players an extra reason to use each god and each weapon. However, at the design level, this actually exacerbates the potential problem. You see, if the player likes the game's mechanics, they will inherently want to try everything. In this case, the player is already having fun and satisfied, so there's nothing to worry about. But what if the player doesn't quite love the mechanics? You can tell them that there's new tools to make the mechanics more interesting, and that might encourage them to keep playing, but if the task to unlock those tools is win 10 runs, or collect 1000 currency, they'll likely give up long before reaching that, since they don't find the task fun already, and asking them to just keep grinding the task away is even more mind-numbing.
Why I quit trying to get out of here a while back.
If the task were instead, kill 5 enemies with a single explosion, suddenly the player is thinking, okay, what explosive tools are there, and where can I group 5 enemies close enough? You've tricked them into solving a puzzle by creating an interesting task, even if they don't quite love the base. Maybe they try it once and find it almost worked, but there was one small problem, so they adjust the plan to account for that and try again. You've tricked them into doing 2 more runs just by presenting a single interesting objective.
It drives their sense of progress more than anything at all.
And now they've unlocked the tools to hopefully make the core mechanics more engaging to them. If the task was simply do 2 runs, they might never have tried in the first place despite being the same net ask.
Perhaps I would have stuck to it.
Isaac has a massive list of items that are all unlocked by doing specific tasks through achievements. Not all of them are amazing, but many reward interesting ideas, and each is rewarding inherently because the player wants to discover it. Picking up 2 battery items in a single run, increasing to +5 size in a single run, using Pandora's box in the dark room, entering 6 shops in one run are all interesting objectives that make the player think and play differently than they otherwise would. Maybe in trying this they discover a new favorite item or synergy that they would never have discovered otherwise. Even if the task isn't unique, the reward is. Hades' achievement system provides currency as the reward for almost every goal.
You think you can butter me up with such trifles?
If the task and the reward isn't interesting, the player will just keep doing the same thing they've been doing and get the reward that way. Or they might think that the game is too boring and simplistic because they haven't had a reason to try using anything else. These hidden meta goals, be they achievements, secrets, or something else, are the things that I remember most fondly from all of my favorite roguelikes, and Hades is staunchly lacking in this regard. I will never forget the time I thought I finished Returnal, and then the game told me, hey, this isn't the ending at all. Go back and explore more and find some secrets because you haven't even seen half the game yet.
That's a good one.
The best roguelikes offer meaningful, exciting rewards to chase after via these systems. Each new item in Isaac is unlocked via a discrete task, but it's fun to unlock simply to see what the new reward actually is, and it gives an inherent incentive to the player to start a new run. They want to find the new thing and see what it does. I mentioned earlier that the boons are dynamic and interesting upgrades and not simple stat increases, but barring a few mostly narrative exceptions, almost all of the meta progression you unlock from doing these challenges is basic and boring stat upgrades. There are no additional boons to unlock from doing anything special, no secret missions to unlock some new synergy from a god, and no conniving quests from a god to unlock some new power for them to offer you. All the boons available to you on your first run are the exact same boons you can find on your 100th run and on your 1000th run. You'll never find something excitingly unexpected from a god beyond more dialogue, which, while fun to listen to, at a gameplay level can feel underwhelming as a reward.
A consolation prize.
To explain this point as simply as I can, most roguelikes let you unlock cool new things to find during your runs. The currency-focused grind in Hades almost exclusively unlocks new things for you to bring with you, but rarely changes what you find along the journey.
You could have avoided this outcome any number of ways.
While I'm discussing the grindy nature of Hades' challenges, I must also address the pacing of the game's systems and the grind behind them as well. Now, this is a deeply subjective topic, so perhaps you didn't mind at all, and if so, that's awesome. Feel free to skip ahead.
Perhaps you know better than I.
To me personally though, I feel Hades missed the sweet spot by a wide margin here. When you first start, the game dumps you right into a run, and this cold open works great, straight into the action. Once you get back to the hub, you're introduced to the more visual novel side of the game, and then you quickly go right back at it. After this point, the game seems to stretch out how long it takes to introduce new mechanics.
They'll be waiting for a long, long time before they get the chance to bring them up.
The mirror takes a while to both earn the upgrades and unlock the ability to purchase later upgrades. The achievement system takes a couple more runs to arrive, and then the weapon aspects take a bit too long to arrive after that, especially the final aspect of each weapon, which is the meaningful one. And even Zagreus' 5th call ability takes several more hours to be introduced. If you started the game and found it too simple or boring, you'd have to trudge through a lot more of that before getting these new tools.
I cannot suffer this for long.
This even creates narrative weirdness, as, for example, I didn't meet Thanatos until after I had already beaten Hades, so moments like him congratulating me on finally beating Hades a dozen runs later felt weirdly jarring and out of sync. I had already done it before we even met. Why are you remarking on this at all, much less so long afterward?
So how come it took so long for him to show up in the first place?
Supergiant likely chose this approach to not overwhelm new players with too much to understand, and also was likely targeting a player base that was less familiar with roguelikes to begin with.
What a bunch of dummies!
And it's for that reason that I want to clarify that I'm not necessarily saying that the game needs to introduce mechanics faster, but at the very least differently. If they were unlocked through unique challenges that the player could accomplish at any time, as discussed earlier, then this would allow more advanced players, or players who are simply not fully enjoying the simplicity, to opt more directly into getting those tools, and in a way that is innately compelling too.
That's more motivation than I've ever heard.
I want to grow into the game's mechanics. I don't want to wait around for the game's mechanics to catch up and grow into me. The mirror takes so long to grind enough currency to unlock all the tools that I actually was able to reach the true ending of the game before even revealing the final section of mirror upgrades. This goes hand in hand with another weird issue the game suffers from in currency bloat. There's a unique currency for each different upgrade type, and it borders on MMO or mobile game levels of clunky.
Ugh, what a mess.
There's the currency for money during runs, and then there's the currency for progression outside of runs, but then there's the currency for conversations, and then the currency for late game conversations, and then the currency for mostly cosmetic based building, and then the currency for mostly musical based building, and then the currency for unlocking mechanics, and then the heat system, which uses its own weird currency metric, which I was refraining from mentioning because the heat system brings a deeper level of its own pacing issues.
Quite frankly, you could use a lot of work.
The Pact of Punishment, or heat system, is a tool to make the difficulty harder. It's unlocked after beating Hades once, which is ostensibly a perfectly valid time to unlock it, and the heat system actually helps alleviate some of the variety and repetition issues that the game suffers from. It's through the heat system that you can unlock the remixed bosses, along with a new suite of enemy effects that make them more interesting to engage with, and many other effects as well. And the heat system actually helps to alleviate some of the variety and repetition issues that the game suffers from, particularly at the enemy and world level. This also helps with the weird difficulty curve of the game, whereby the more you play, the easier it gets. Not because you, the player, got better, though you probably did too, but because you unlock more and more powerful permanent buffs. A lot of games have a weirdly inverse difficulty curve which can undercut the challenge of the game, but typically roguelikes strive to make the game easier through learning rather than power, or at least give more powerful foes on pace with you getting more powerful tools.
Well, they say repetition is the key to mastery, Prince said.
Hades doesn't let you turn on difficulty modifiers until after you beat a run, which means if you found the fodder or early areas too simple, they will stay simple until you can beat everything, which can make starting over feel even more dull and repetitious.
Just need to keep at it.
This is all mostly fine though, and just a victim of the game being generally too slow to introduce all the tools to you. It's actually after unlocking the heat system that the real issues arise. Because let's say that you did find the game too easy and want to bump the difficulty up a lot. Well, the heat system lets you do that, but slowly. You see, the game only lets you earn the rewards from each tier one at a time. You can turn on a lot of punishments, but you'll only get reward credit for one tier at a time. So while yes, the player can bump up the difficulty to a place they find more comfortable, the system is designed to make that feel bad. And in fact, both the game and the characters in-game warn you that you shouldn't do that.
Don't need to turn the heat gauge so high to earn those bounties.
The end result is that the design of this system somewhat subtly makes the player play a less fun version of what they want, or else makes them feel bad for playing how they want to. And now the player is slowly grinding up difficulty one tier at a time, and if you don't win, you don't even get the next tier.
We've better things to do, I think.
To its credit, much like the rest of the game, it lets the player opt in and target punishments in exactly the way they want to. In this way, the game becomes accessible to players of all skill levels, as they can customize the difficulty level to exactly what they want from the game. This also means that they might choose a set of punishments that are fairly negligible for the bow, but a huge issue for the sword. But now there's a new issue. because the player doesn't want those punishments for the weapon it's not good with. They could toggle the whole list back and forth between each run, but that's somewhat tedious, so they might actually just stop using the other less effective weapons.
That way nobody slows me down.
In this way, the system somewhat inadvertently reinforces that perceived lack of variety. The game isn't actually that repetitive, but once again, it gives you the options to make it more similar in a way that feels encouraged by the game or the design ethos. The heat system also has a weird design quirk whereby you have to grind it up separately for each weapon, meaning going from one weapon to another will rapidly swing the difficulty if you only are at 6 heat on one weapon, but at 12 on another. The player again might say, hey, playing on low heat isn't fun anymore, so I'll just keep using the weapon that's at the high heat instead. Yet again, the system is subtly reinforcing an unintentional lack of variety. And this heat differential is a very natural and common issue to run into, because if you fail a run with a weapon, you won't get credit for that heat tier, meaning you either switch to a new weapon and keep upping the heat of a different weapon, or you repeat the run with that weapon again. It's a lose-lose whereby you either intentionally opt for less variety with the same weapon, or further the jarring discrepancy between weapons, making you less likely to choose variety later. And that's ignoring the innate weirdness that can occur when jumping constantly between massively different difficulty tiers.
Making matters much more complicated than they have to be.
I also have my own personal disagreement with some of the punishments, or at least the way they're implemented. The ones that introduce variety to the enemies or stages are great. However, many up the difficulty not by increasing the challenge of the enemies, but by making the player weaker. If you're thinking, isn't that just a different way to increase the challenge?
Wrong!
Okay, you're not wrong, but let me explain why the difference matters. Not all difficulty is the same. It's the same reason why Dark Souls is so beloved by many despite being a quote-unquote difficult game. You could make a difficult boss by giving it an absurd health bar, and while that's more difficult, it isn't more fun.
You know full well that wasn't a fair fight.
Instead, you could give the boss a bunch of new moves, like Neo does with its New Game Plus system. Assuming the new moves aren't poorly designed, the difficulty has increased, but by providing the player with an interesting new challenge to overcome, rather than by making the fight more tedious. Additionally, for the subsection of players where the entire point of roguelikes is to become the most powerful possible, providing tougher challenges is still engaging, but being weaker is not. It's directly opting to make the game less fun. Adding unique modifiers to enemies that let them teleport or have damaging beams connecting them or create decoy clones creates fun new challenges. The player is engaging with the mechanic systems more. Increasing the price of shop items just makes the player buy fewer items and thus interact with the game's mechanics less.
I'm short of coin.
Good difficulty options highlight the game's mechanics and make the player think in new ways. Difficulty options that make the player interact with the game's mechanics less highlight more of the design flaws of the system and make the experience a more generic one.
Is this really as good as it gets?
Remember how I said this game was also the best roguelike? I know I've been laying into it for a bit, but that's still true. So let's move on to another very important aspect to highlight the game's excellence. Hades is beautiful. There's no denying it. Supergiant took hell and somehow managed to fuse this pseudo ink-drawn art style with bright, vibrant colors to somehow make the realm of eternal punishment look like the most jolly and pleasant of places. Neon pink is not a color that I would ever expect to see in a depiction of the underworld. Of course, there's still skeletons and death everywhere, so if you look past the colors, they still managed to make Hades carry the proper gravitas that the name deserves.
Plenty of time for me to live up to my notorious reputation.
I'm not a visual artist, so I can't give informed analysis of the actual art techniques on display, but it doesn't take an expert to see that the game is majestic. Arguably one of the best looking games of all time, much less of roguelikes. What I can talk about though, is the way in which the art and themes enhance the game. Because while yes, the game is pretty, there's also a lot going on with the artistic direction that directly impacts the gameplay. Each layer of Hades has its own unique themes and energy, and Supergiant managed to make that readily apparent in some very cool ways. Visually, they're all distinct, and each layer of hell has unique environmental traps and pitfalls that fit those biomes perfectly. Tartarus has the ambiance of a cold castle prison, and uses spikes and crumbling pillars. Asphodel lets the burning river flow through each stage, creating dangerous, or perhaps advantageous, lava pools all around. Elysium honors the fallen with statues that will waste no time striking at you should you step too close. And the poison traps and cramped corridors of the Temple of Styx perfectly simulate the experience of navigating a labyrinth.
You truly take me to the best of places.
And the enemies in each biome reflect that too. The labyrinth has cretins and vermin crawling out of every crack in the walls. Elysium has fallen soldiers using traditional weapons and riding chariots at you. Asphodel has fiery skeletons, burned witches, bombers, and sentient rocks. While the prisons of Tartarus have the simplest of orange and yellow shades and chained souls. What I find truly impressive about all of this though, is the manner in which each boss is a summation of the enemies that came before. The Fury Sisters use the same dash attacks and projectile orbs that the denizens of Tartarus use. Likewise, the Bone Hydra strikes using the same ground slam attacks from the floating rocks, and the same long projectiles of the Burnt Witches of Asphodel. My personal favorite is Asterius and Theseus, who dash using the same mechanics of the chariots, and who use the same shield and spear moves from the Great Shield enemies and the Long Spear enemies. This is fantastic not just at a thematic level, but at a gameplay level. The game is subtly teaching the player the moves of the upcoming boss as they clear each zone, and the player likely has no idea.
We've been doing everything you said this entire time.
By the time you reach the end of the biome, you must show mastery over all of the foes you faced along the way before you can advance to the next area. And to top all of this off, the final boss, Hades himself, confronts the player using each and every tool across the entirety of all the areas of his realm. His boss design wraps in all aspects of the game. He not only acts as a boss, but also summons minions from every area, meaning both single target and AoE builds have something to be useful in this fight. But then he also places dynamic traps around the battlefield that need to be avoided or dealt with, meaning that if you took the punishment to increase trap damage thinking it wasn't relevant, think again, because Hades is wrapping in all 3 pillars of threats from the game. And that boon from Athena that lowers trap damage suddenly seems useful to players other than those still struggling with the spatial awareness of not stepping onto traps.
Be careful where you step.
Additionally, in Hades' first stage, he functions exactly like Zagreus, with a normal attack, a special spin move, and a cast move, thus tying the connection between father and son into even the gameplay level.
Kinda like your dad with you, I guess.
And that beautiful gameplay lore connection is not some one-off moment. In fact, it's pretty much the opposite. Every mechanic of the game is explained in some kind of lore-justified manner. Roguelikes need the player to die a lot. Luckily, Zagreus is the son of Hades, and dying is a thing he does often. No one in the world is surprised to see Zagreus die, and Hades will always allow him to come back and start running again. Roguelikes need to have procedural generation in the areas. Turns out the layers of Hades are constantly shifting around and changing themselves in order to prevent escapes as a security defense measure. Roguelikes need to have items that power up the player. The gods of Olympus all grant boons to Zagreus to help him escape because they all want to support his endeavor for their own selfish reasons. Roguelikes have to have a reason for the player to keep doing the same thing over and over. At first, Zagreus is trying to escape and thus will try and fail with unending determination. Later, Zagreus is placed in charge of testing the security defenses and must keep escaping in order to make sure security is up to snuff. Each weapon specifically is a part of Hades' armory and has a historical reason why it ended up there. Every single detail and game mechanic was given proper care and thought as for why it would exist in that way in an in-universe lore-friendly explanation. Normally, you just have to accept that a game is the way it is. But Supergiant masterfully crafted this entire world so that the player doesn't have to suspend even a shred of disbelief. Even the target dummy has a secret reason for why he allows you to beat him up repeatedly, and a motivation for doing so behind your dad's back.
I'd like to call it madness, truth be told.
Lastly, I also have to touch on the music. The soundtrack in this game is amazing. I think personally it might be their worst soundtrack yet, but that's also like saying it's only the 9th best soundtrack in video games. Any other studio would kill to have music this good. What might potentially elevate this soundtrack over Supergiant's other work though is the dynamic nature of it. They somehow managed to create a seamless system whereby the music track starts simply, then without missing a beat adds in more instruments when the combat starts to provide a more active sound, then calms down again the moment it's all over, treading layers away from the track, all while playing the same track. Here, take a listen and see what I mean.
Clearly wiser than I estimated.
Music, art, theming. It's rare for a game to ace even one of those aspects, and Hades somehow manages to nail every one. Combine that with incredible voice acting and performances that bring out the tragedy and the humor of the writing, and you have one of the most compelling worlds to just exist in that's ever been created.
That deserves a commendation, I should think.
I have a couple more details I want to point out that didn't fit cleanly into the script or were too small to dedicate a lot of time to, so here goes the lightning round. If you're playing with a PlayStation controller, the light bar will change to match the color scheme of the god you are speaking with. Some boons will even change the visual effects of your abilities to reflect the god enhancing them. Theseus will always be blessed by a god that you didn't worship that run. Summon items won't work against lore-relevant targets, such as Skelly not betraying his employer, or Meg not attacking Hades, and they'll even mock you for trying.
Poseidon ought not meddle in others' affairs.
There's a simple base building type mechanic that lets you renovate the throne room, and provides a cozy Animal Crossing type influence as well. The direct narrative focus can lead to the game feeling extra empty and killing motivation post-game when dialogue starts drying up. It is sadly not actually infinite.
What you're attempting is impossible.
Most of the weapon aspects are barely different, with only the final tier providing truly interesting distinctions. The rarity system on boons doesn't really add anything and typically just makes me not choose something I want because it didn't roll high enough, so I choose something that won't get in the way and hope that I get the upgraded version later. The consumables from Charon's well are mostly worthless, and the selling mechanic is far too random to be useful. Even though enemy designs are expertly tied into the world, there are still far too few, and this is by far the most lacking aspect of variety in the game.
We're stretched a little thin, as you can see.
The story would have been perfect at a meta level if Zagreus had never succeeded. Being a game about Greek tragedies, where Zagreus is himself tragically doomed to always escape Greece, only to perish immediately upon having a brief conversation with his mother, is one of the most perfect meta-contextual bows to tie around the whole story. The ending and the true ending are both good, but in true Supergiant fashion, they botch what could have been an incredible ending to deliver an okay one.
Perhaps I ought to be more careful how I speak of them.
And lastly, one of the biggest boons this game has over many roguelikes is the quality of life features. Things like highlighting new boons that you haven't used yet, showing the invulnerability timer clearly, having a target dummy to practice with, having unique sound effects when clearing a room to indicate that there's a trove, or a chaos gate, or a fishing spot, or so on, all go miles to make this game feel polished and complete. But by far the most important one is the in-game wiki. The game gives you a lore journal that tracks everything from characters to relationship progress, to items including boons, which boons are needed to see which duos, and exactly what each one does. Some people may like the mysterious nature of not knowing exactly what an item does when you pick it up, but you're a damn dirty liar if you say you play Binding of Isaac without the wiki open in a different tab.
Silence, you monster. I'll hear no more such wicked lies.
In many ways, Hades feels like the culmination of Supergiant's 3 previous games. It's got the reactive commentary on your actions from Bastion, the elegant complexity of skills and intermixing them with unique combinations from Transistor, and the elaborate character narratives of Pyre. Sure, it's weaker than each of those games at those specific aspects, but to have combined them so well is even more impressive.
And here they said it couldn't be done.
Hades is also trying to do its own thing separate from those games, and you can see that learning from decades of roguelikes everywhere in the game too. Hades is a masterful game, and found some very impressive solutions to many classic roguelike problems. In doing so, Hades also lost what some might describe as the soul of a roguelike game. It's undeniably great in its own right, but depending on what you love about roguelikes, it might not be good at all, or it might be the greatest, but it's definitely worth talking about and learning from, because history will long tell the tale of Hades. And it's only Supergiant's second best game. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I'm always grateful that people even care what I have to say, much less enjoy it as much as you have been. I would super appreciate it if you could like or subscribe. It helps a lot, even if I feel slimy every time I say that. And let me know what you think, because I love seeing the discussion, even if I was off base on something. Hades is one of my favorite games, and I really enjoyed getting to do a deep dive and take a critical eye to it. When I initially made this video, it was just going to be why Hades is the best roguelike. But then as I was writing the script, I realized that there's also a lot of flaws that are almost directly antagonistic to the idea of being a roguelike. I always end up cutting so much of what I wanted to talk about and the video still ends up too long, but I was reading my previous scripts and realized that I apologize for taking so long every time. So this time I'm not apologizing. My next video will inevitably be out later than I wanted, and that's just how it's gonna be. Anyway, that's just my 5 cents. Thanks for watching.